Hello and very welcome. Our channel narrates the life stories of our viewers from all around the world. To protect individuals' privacy, names are sometimes altered in the stories. My name is Mark, the only son of a family who, after many years, was finally blessed with a child. My mother became pregnant with me 9 years after her marriage, and from the moment she realized there was a baby growing inside her, it felt like she had been given the whole world. My family's financial situation was very good. Both my parents were doctors and highly respected individuals. As I grew older and started understanding the world around me, I realized what a wonderful family I was born into. Since my mother had me later in life, it seemed as though my parents were entirely devoted to me. From a young age, they hired private tutors for me, bought me a piano, and encouraged me to start learning how to play it. Alongside that, they also started teaching me English. My family gave me so much attention that all the kids in the family envied my life. Everyone was jealous of me. My parents never said a harsh word to me and provided everything I needed, and even more. As I grew older and started school, my mother prepared school lunches for me so thoughtfully and tastefully that even though many kids at my school came from well-off families, they envied her care and the love that existed in our family. Their eyes were always on me. And sometimes this bothered me because I didn't want anyone to look at me with envy. My father was always my role model, and my mother, with all her love and care, held a special place in my heart. Both of them supervised my studies closely and cared a lot about me being the best in school. However, they were never the kind of parents who imposed their desires or expectations on me. They didn't expect me to fulfill their dreams, but instead allowed me to pursue my own interests from a very young age. I wasn't into hanging out with friends much and had very few close ones. I mostly enjoyed spending time by myself. Despite this, my family's attention to every detail in my life was so profound that they even discreetly consulted a doctor to make sure my lack of interest in socializing wouldn't lead to isolation or depression. As I grew older and entered middle school, nearly all the girls in my extended family wanted to befriend me. In terms of looks, I resembled my mother. She was a beautiful woman, and I inherited her green eyes. My father was a handsome man, and I got my height and build from him. Because of this, everyone in the family admired my appearance, and I was always the center of attention at gatherings. From a young age, my mother always guided me, saying I should never become arrogant. She would remind me that no matter how successful or wealthy I became, I was still just a human being and nothing more. She emphasized that in the end, all that remains of us is our goodness, and what's more important than wealth is the legacy of a good name. I took her words to heart and always tried not to hurt anyone's feelings. I was careful never to act inappropriately, even if someone wronged me. I would simply distance myself from them rather than retaliate. This philosophy became my guide in life. With excellent grades, I entered high school and chose mathematics because I wanted to become an engineer. Although my mother, being a doctor herself, might have wanted me to follow her path, she encouraged me to continue with music alongside my studies and always be my best. I studied hard and got into the best university. My family threw a huge party, inviting all our relatives and friends. That day was one of the happiest days of my life. I was proud of myself and all the effort I had put in. However, I became slightly arrogant, thinking that since I had achieved so much at a young age, I would succeed in all areas of life and wouldn't need advice or help from others. When I entered university, my father had already taught me how to drive. He bought me an automatic car right from the start. So many people wanted to befriend me. However, since I had never had close friends in my life, I wasn't interested in superficial connections. I went to university with the mindset of focusing on my studies and forming relationships with people who were on my level. On my first day in class, a girl caught my attention. At first, I was drawn to her looks. She was calm and reserved, unlike other girls who clung to me with obvious ulterior motives. Around the same time, I became friends with a guy named Zach. He was a great guy, and it was clear he came from a cultured family. Since my father had always taught me to value a person's character above all else, I never assumed that someone's financial status guaranteed they had good manners or a high level of culture. Zach, like me, was a calm and down-to-earth guy, not interested in childish drama. His main goal was to focus on his studies, and he often said that his mother dreamed of him becoming an engineer, which motivated him to work hard to make her happy. Zach was the first friend I became close to, and our friendship grew to the point where I'd go out with him and even share details about my life. One day, Zach came to me excitedly and told me that one of the girls in our class really liked me. Apparently, since she knew Zach was my close friend, she had approached him to share this. When Zach finished speaking, I thought he was joking, so I started laughing. But his expression was serious, and I could even see excitement in his eyes. He seemed genuinely happy that a girl liked me so much that she'd made the first move. Zach spoke so much about her that I became curious to see who she was. In my mind, I thought she might be the same girl I had already noticed and liked. However, when Zach pointed her out from a distance, I was surprised and went quiet. Finally, I turned to him and said that this girl had a reputation for liking half the guys in the faculty, and her words couldn't be taken seriously. I added that if she was saying anything about love, it was probably nonsense. She had likely noticed me getting out of my car the first day of school and was after my money. After I finished talking, Zach seemed a bit disappointed, as if I had burst his bubble. He looked a little hurt and said, "I thought you might have found real love." After that day, Zach and I didn't talk about that girl anymore, and I advised him to be careful not to fall for her tricks. One day, Zach caught a bad cold and couldn't come to the university. That day, I happened to run into the girl I had noticed on the first day, right outside the university gates. I felt like this was the perfect opportunity to start a conversation with her and open a line of communication. I was hopeful that she might accept my approach. At first, I acted as though I didn't realize we were in the same field of study. I started the conversation by asking her about the program, and eventually we introduced ourselves. The beautiful girl introduced herself as Miriam. We got to know each other that day, but she didn't behave in a way that made me feel she was interested in me. She didn't come across as one of those overly friendly, open-minded girls either. Because of her reserved behavior, I felt a bit down, thinking I might be falling for someone who didn't feel the same way. I even began imagining my heartbreak. But then, something changed. Miriam started sitting next to me, and before I even asked, she offered me her notes. Even Zach was surprised. He kept bombarding me with questions, saying that if something was going on between us, as my best friend, he should be the first to know. Eventually, Zach managed to get me to admit how I felt about Miriam. Since Zach was aware of my family's financial situation, he mentioned that Miriam's family didn't seem to be as well off as ours. However, I stuck to my principles and told him I didn't care about money. I was focused on her character. When Zach saw how firmly I believed this, he suggested I discuss my feelings with my parents before anything became serious. Zach's advice was always good, so I decided to follow it. I first approached my father and told him I liked a girl from my faculty, giving him her details. When I mentioned that her family's financial situation wasn't like ours, my father didn't seem to mind either. He dismissed the concern, saying it wasn't important. And then my father shared the situation with my mother. They decided that we should formally propose to Miriam as soon as possible. My mother believed that even if two people were getting to know each other, the family's involvement and oversight were necessary to ensure compatibility and avoid falling deeply in love before discovering any fundamental differences. I respected my mother's advice and decided to follow her guidance. One day, I shared my feelings with Miriam and asked her to give me her mother's contact information so my mother could reach out to her. Miriam agreed, but said she wanted us to spend a few weeks talking to get to know each other better before involving our families. She explained that she didn't want to embarrass herself in front of her family by introducing someone she wasn't certain about. I respected her wishes and even shared her request with my mother, who also agreed. For about a month, Miriam and I spent time together, discussing everything we thought was important for starting a relationship. During that time, I knew in my heart that I wanted to marry her no matter what. I had already given her my heart, but Miriam seemed meticulous and wanted everything to happen perfectly. After a month of getting to know each other, Miriam finally agreed for my mother to contact her mother. A few days later, my parents and I visited Miriam's family for the formal proposal. I was incredibly nervous that day, constantly worrying that something might go wrong and that Miriam and I wouldn't end up together. Before the visit, I had spoken with Zach, who had advised me to handle things maturely. He even suggested that if my parents strongly opposed the marriage, I should reconsider so as not to create resentment. I promised myself that I'd approach everything logically. When we arrived at Miriam's home, the house was noticeably old from the outside. In our family, we weren't the type to judge people based on appearances, so we entered without making assumptions. Miriam's brother opened the door for us. She had a brother and a sister, with Miriam being the middle child. Miriam's father appeared to be in poor health, while her mother was younger and seemed to be the dominant figure in the household. It was clear that everything revolved around her. After the initial introductions, I noticed that my father's expression became a bit tense. It was evident that he wasn't entirely happy with what he saw, but he remained polite and composed. However, based on Miriam's brother and father's behavior, it was clear they didn't have the best manners. Despite this, everyone tried to make the day go smoothly. When we got back to the car, my father calmly told me that he didn't see Miriam as a suitable match for me. Not just because of the financial gap between our families, but also due to the cultural differences. I found it hard to stick to what I had previously told Zach about handling things rationally. I immediately started arguing with my father, telling him that I liked Miriam for who she was, and that her family's behavior didn't matter to me because Miriam herself had been nothing but respectful. My father tried to reason with me, explaining that in marriage, such differences would inevitably surface over time. He warned me that relationships were not always as they seemed during the initial phase of getting to know someone. Despite his advice, I remained firm in my decision. Seeing my determination, my family reluctantly agreed to accept Miriam as my future wife. Since her family couldn't afford to host any ceremonies, All the arrangements and expenses fell on us. Despite the financial differences, which didn't matter much to us, my father kept emphasizing that these cultural and social differences could affect our life together. Nevertheless, we held a modest wedding in line with our family's traditions, with only a few guests, and started our married life together. Miriam didn't bring any dowry, and the house I had chosen was already furnished. In the beginning, our life together seemed like any other marriage, full of happiness and mutual effort. I took Miriam on a wonderful honeymoon and made it my mission to treat her in the best possible way. However, a few months into the marriage, problems began to surface. Miriam started expressing dissatisfaction with our relationship. One day, during a heated argument, she openly criticized me for not being emotionally responsive to her needs. That argument escalated to the point where I went to her mother's house to ask her to talk to Miriam and help resolve the situation. After leaving her mother's house, one of their neighbors approached me. She asked somewhat curiously why I had decided to marry Miriam. I was puzzled but let her continue. She said Miriam had a reputation for associating with wealthy men in the past, only to leave them after benefiting from their wealth. Hearing this made me freeze for a moment. I firmly told the woman that I was Miriam's husband and wouldn't tolerate anyone speaking ill of my wife. But her words stuck with me and occupied my thoughts for days. Even though I trusted Miriam deeply, I couldn't bring myself to confront her about what the neighbor had said. Over time, certain behaviors from Miriam began to puzzle me further. On one occasion, she mentioned that she preferred not to see Zach, my close friend, often because she had unsettling thoughts when he was around. At first, I dismissed it as a misunderstanding or her being uncomfortable around him. One day, overwhelmed by my frustrations, I confided in Zach. I told him everything, from Miriam's criticisms of me to her strange behaviors. Zach listened silently for a while before finally speaking. He reminded me that I had chosen Miriam as my wife, and that I was now living the consequences of my decision. When I tried to justify myself, saying I had no idea about certain aspects of Miriam's personality, Zach cut me off. He reminded me how my father had warned me against marrying Miriam and how I had ignored those warnings. My father, Zach said, had seen everything clearly from the beginning. In the end, Zach's words were true. My pride had led me to make this decision without truly listening to others' advice, and now I was paying the price for my arrogance. One evening when I came home, I saw that my mother-in-law was there, and both Miriam and her mother were wearing matching outfits that were revealing. I avoided looking directly at them out of discomfort. However, Miriam brazenly took my hand, led me to her mother, and looked me in the eyes, while saying she would only forgive her dowry under one condition. At that moment, I realized Miriam had no genuine feelings of love for me, and that her motives were purely materialistic. Her dowry was considerable, despite my father's repeated advice to set a reasonable amount since I didn't know her well enough. Still, I had insisted on giving her a large dowry, standing against my family's warnings. Miriam then proposed a shocking condition, saying she would sign a paper officially forgiving her dowry if I agreed to spend one night with her and her mother. Her lack of morality and disrespect for the sanctity of marriage stunned me. While the proposal was outrageous, the weight of her dowry and my financial commitments compelled me to reluctantly accept her terms. After the ordeal, Miriam signed the document and I left. The next day, I went to my parents' house, determined to tell them the truth, no matter how difficult. When my father saw my distressed face, he immediately asked if there were problems between me and Miriam. For the first time in years, I broke down and cried. I shared with him how I had been hurt by Miriam's behavior, though I couldn't bring myself to mention her shocking proposal involving her mother. My father reassured me, while my mother cried silently, devastated by the pain I was going through. Unlike Miriam's family, mine were calm and non-confrontational people, not the kind to create drama or seek revenge. Instead, they encouraged me to approach the situation logically. My mother reminded me that this painful experience would teach me to make more cautious decisions in the future. I began the divorce process with the help of our lawyer and soon separated from Miriam. Only my best friend Zach knew how deeply I had once loved her, and how painful it was to realize the truth about her character. Zach also shared something shocking. The day I finalized my divorce, he told me that Miriam and her mother had made inappropriate proposals to him as well. Hearing this confirmed that I had made the right decision to walk away. Though the divorce was finalized quickly, I knew people would gossip about how my marriage had failed within just a few months. However, I also knew that with time the subject would fade and people would find new topics to discuss. Years have passed since then, and Zach remains my closest friend. Despite my family's suggestions to consider other women for marriage, I haven't been able to bring myself to trust anyone else. Even though I know Miriam wasn't the person I believed her to be, she still occupies a part of my heart. Instead of pursuing another relationship, I chose to focus on my education and career. Sometimes we pay a heavy price for falling in love, but we learn invaluable lessons in the process. For me, that lesson has been to be cautious with my trust and decisions. As my mother often says, sometimes we have no choice but to accept life's difficulties. If we don't resolve our problems, they might end up consuming us. Her words have stayed with me as I try to heal and move forward, one step at a time.